I was sitting at the back of the ballroom when the bride raised her champagne glass and said with a smile sharp enough to cut, "I saved him from that broken woman." Laughter rippled through the room like wildfire. People actually laughed, clinked their glasses, nodded, as if she had just told the most charming joke of the evening. My face burned, but not with shame. It was heat from memories clawing their way back from wounds I had taught myself to live beside. I felt my stomach twist, but I didn't cry. I didn't flinch. And then through the glitter and noise, a waitress stepped forward. Slowly, as if she was walking through water. She reached the center of the room directly in front of the head table, and without hesitation she removed her cap, held it in trembling hands, and looked the bride dead in the eye. "I'm his daughter," she said, "and I have something to say." The laughter collapsed into silence. The bride's face drained her mouth, opening with no words behind it. Just silence. That was the moment everything changed. But to tell you why that silence mattered, I need to go back. Because my story didn't begin in that ballroom. It began in my car in the parking lot outside the Ridgewood Grand Hotel, clutching an ivory envelope sealed with gold. My name, Amara Lane, was written in careful calligraphy across the front. The invitation had come weeks earlier. No return address, no note, just those words: "Mr. Gavin Rhee and Ms. Serena Vale request the honor of your presence." I nearly threw it away. Who sends their ex-fiancé an invitation to the wedding? At first I thought it was a mistake. Then I thought maybe it was pity, some twisted olive branch. But deep down I knew what it really was: a message. A way to remind me that Gavin Rhee, the man I had spent 6 years building a life with, was officially erasing me. I hadn't seen him in 3 years. Not since that night he packed a duffel bag, left a note, and disappeared. He didn't even look back. Said he couldn't live in sadness anymore. That was the night after we lost the baby. But it wasn't just me he abandoned. It was her, too. Laya, his daughter. She wasn't mine by blood, but she was 5 when she came into my life. I had loved her from the second she slipped her tiny hand into mine and called me Mommy. When Gavin left, she stayed. Not because she had to, but because she chose to. That choice nearly saved me. For months, I was a shell. Waking up felt like dragging myself through cement. Every photo on the wall, every song on the radio, was a reminder of the family that had barely existed before it shattered. I ignored friends. I ignored mirrors. But somehow I didn't ignore her. I still packed her lunch every morning. I still braided her hair. I still studied spelling lists with her, even when my own eyes were too swollen from crying. One night, I sat on the bathroom floor shaking from yet another call from a debt collector when Laya knocked gently and slipped inside. She was 10 small, still barely up to my ribs. She sat beside me on the tile and handed me half a peanut butter sandwich. "You forgot to eat," she whispered. That was the moment I realized I wasn't entirely alone. And if she wasn't giving up on me, I couldn't give up on myself. It took 2 years, therapy, night shifts, 1,000 little self-help books, but I began to stitch myself back together. I started designing again: websites, logos, anything I could freelance. I moved us into a smaller place closer to her school. We laughed sometimes, real laughter that hurt our ribs, but healed something inside. I was learning how to live again. Then the invitation arrived. Laya was 16 by then, sharper, braver, wiser than I ever was at that age. She found the envelope where I had left it on the kitchen table and read it aloud. When she looked at me, her eyes didn't shake. "You should go," she said. "For what?" I asked. "So I can watch him start a new life with someone richer, prettier." "No," she said firmly. "So he sees what he lost. So you see what you've become." She wasn't talking about him. She was talking about me. And in her gaze, I saw a version of myself I had stopped believing in. So I said yes. Uncle Joe, who had helped raise me after my mother passed, agreed to drive us. He had never liked Gavin, said his smile was too polished and his eyes too still. I asked Joe to sit in the back row with me, hidden, almost invisible, because I didn't go there to be seen, or so I thought. The wedding was everything you'd expect from someone desperate to prove their life was perfect. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the ceiling like glass teardrops. White orchids lined the aisle. Every napkin was monogrammed in gold. Even the string quartet seemed to play as if the music itself was performing for judgment. I stood in the doorway longer than I should have, steadying my breathing. Leia had already slipped into the kitchen to begin her shift with the catering staff. She swore her job that night had nothing to do with me. But I knew better. She wasn't there to serve champagne and hors d'oeuvres. She was there because she knew I might fall apart, and she wasn't going to let me face this battlefield alone. Uncle Joe was already seated near the back. When our eyes met, he gave me a small nod that said without words, "You're stronger than you think, even if it feels like hell." I slipped into the chair beside him, folded my hands in my lap, and tried not to look toward the altar. But of course I did. Gavin stood near the front, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing that half-smile he'd perfected years ago. To anyone else, it probably looked charming, warm, magnetic. But I knew it for what it was, armor. I knew the silence behind that smile. I remembered the night he left with eyes that were shallow and unfeeling, not a backward glance in my direction. Seeing him now unchanged twisted something deep in my chest. And then there was her, Serena Vale. She floated down the aisle like she owned the very air-white silk hugging her frame, blonde hair gleaming under the lights. Her laughter was too sharp, her gestures too polished. Every move seemed choreographed to say, "Look at me. Look at what I have. Look at what she never could be." They said their vows in front of a floral arch so big it nearly swallowed them whole. Gavin's voice didn't waver. Serena smiled like she had just won a prize. I chewed the inside of my cheek until I tasted blood, anything to anchor myself in that chair. The reception began quickly after, with waiters weaving through the crowd like dancers, laughter rising and falling with the clinking of glasses. I sat in silence, sipping water, trying to stay present. At one point, Leia passed by with a tray of bruschetta. She winked at me quickly, her face calm, steady, before disappearing again into the crowd. "You okay?" Uncle Joe whispered. Still breathing, I muttered. The toast started. Best man, maid of honor, a cousin. All the usual stories about how Gavin was such a good man, how Serena had made him better. I tuned most of it out, my gaze fixed on the tablecloth in front of me, until a new voice broke through. "I want to say something," Serena said, standing at the head table. She held her champagne flute high, her eyes glittering in the light, though I noticed the steel edge beneath her smile. She didn't look at Gavin, she looked at me. When I met Gavin, she began, he was a good man. But he was hurt, damaged, by someone who didn't know how to love him right. A woman who was too broken to see how lucky she was. My chest seized. I froze, the room spinning hot and cold at once. Her words were daggers dressed as elegance. "She almost ruined him," Serena continued with a laugh, "but I saved him, I healed him, and today he's finally where he belongs." The laughter that followed was crueler than any slap. Glasses clinked, people clapped, and my body screamed to stand, to shout, to throw every truth like fire at this woman who knew nothing of me. Nothing of the nights I held Gavin's hand as he wept over losing custody of his daughter. Nothing of the mornings I searched for jobs on his behalf. Nothing of the ultrasound photo tucked in the back of my drawer, a baby we never got to meet. I wanted to speak, but I couldn't. My throat locked shut and I just sat there staring at her as if my silence could protect me. And then I noticed movement. From the corner near the kitchen, a waitress had stopped walking. She stood frozen, her jaw tight, her fists clenched. Slowly she began to walk forward. Laya. She stepped past tables, past half-finished plates and champagne flutes, straight toward the microphone. My heart stopped. She removed her cap, held it in her hands and said in a voice louder than I'd ever heard from her, "I'm his daughter. And I have something to say." The room broke. Conversations cut off mid-word, glasses stilled mid-air. Serena's smile faltered, twitching at the edges. Gavin turned, his eyes narrowing as if he didn't recognize the girl standing there in a black apron and white button-up shirt. But I recognized her, my daughter, my warrior, my truth. She didn't tremble, not the way I used to when I had to say the smallest truth out loud. Her voice carried clean and steady across the glittering room. "She's not the woman you're mocking," Leia said, chin lifted. "She's the woman who raised me." Serena blinked as if the words wouldn't resolve into meaning, as if language itself had betrayed her. A low gasp swelled and then broke around the tables. Someone lowered a phone like they'd only just realized they were filming a person and not a spectacle. At my ex's wedding, his bride I'm Gavin's daughter, Laya repeated, not looking away. From before he met you. From before he ran away. From before he pretended we didn't exist. Her hands clenched the cap at her side until the fabric wrinkled like an old map. He left when I was 11. Not just my mom, he left me. The last word landed with a dull sweetness, heavy and undeniable. A waiter froze mid-step. Champagne trembled in crystal like a heartbeat you could see. Gavin stood at last, a cautious hand braced on the back of his chair. "Leia not here," he said. But his voice was thinner than I remembered, like paper dried in the sun. She turned toward him with a slow, almost curious tilt of her head. "Oh. Now you remember my name." The syllables didn't crack. They rang. When I sent birthday cards, they came back unopened. When I emailed to say I missed you, you didn't reply. You didn't even block me. You just erased me. The word erased cut deeper than anything that had come before because there it was. The opposite of love wasn't hate. It was absence practiced until it looked like a habit. Serena's smile collapsed. "This is outrageous," she murmured, though it sounded more like a plea than a verdict. Laya looked at her compassionate, in a way only a child who has learned to outgrow pain can be. "You could have asked him the hard questions. You could have looked for the pieces that didn't fit." She drew breath. "Instead, you stood in a room full of strangers and turned my mother into a warning label." The words didn't shout. They settled. They made the air feel heavier, more honest. I felt Uncle Joe's hand hover near mine, not quite touching a quiet guardrail. And then I felt something else. The slow, steady uncoiling of the shame I had carried like a second spine. It wasn't my weight to hold. It never had been. "She didn't break you," Laya said, and now her voice quivered not with fear, but with the cost of truth. "You broke yourself. And then you buried us under the story you liked better." She paused and the silence around her became a kind of choir. "I watched my mom work 2 jobs so we had food. I heard her cry into a pillow so I wouldn't. I told people you were away on business because saying you'd chosen not to love us was worse." A woman at the front pressed a hand to her mouth. Somewhere the string quartet had stopped mid-page. Even the sheet music looked stunned. Gavin's face changed the way glass fogs, first a whisper, then a blur. "I can't take it back," he said quietly. It sounded like he'd found the one sentence in the language that was true and small enough to hold. "No," I answered before I could stop myself. "You can't." The crowd pivoted toward me as if pulled by a magnet. For a second, I felt the old reflex to disappear, to shrink, to make my body into a polite apology. But the reflex met steel and folded. Laya took a step toward us both, and when she spoke again, it was to the room and to the little girl she had once been. "I forgive you," she told Gavin, surprising even me. He flinched, almost grateful. She shook her head lightly. "Not for you. For me. Carrying your absence is exhausting. I'm done." The words landed and then softened like rain on hot pavement. She turned then, small, decisive, and touched my arm. "She's the one who stayed," she said, and pointed to me. The pointing wasn't cruel or triumphant. It was a map drawn for anyone still pretending they were lost. Serena swallowed hard, eyes skittering left and right like a trapped animal searching for a door. "So what now?" she asked, but she wasn't asking us. She was asking the night to rewind. "You blow up our wedding to—" "What?" "To make a scene." Laya's mouth curved not into a smile but into a line that said enough. "You blew it up when you built it on a lie." Her voice gentled. "You can still choose the truth." It was a kindness I would not have thought to offer. We stood in a triangle that kept changing its angles. Mother, daughter, man who left. People watched with the hunger of those who mistake revelation for dessert, but something was shifting underneath the spectacle. You could feel it, the room remembering its humanity. Glasses lowered, hands moved from chests to laps. 3 separate lives, 12 separate years, 1,000 Separate nights were being threaded together in public, needle by needle. Amara Gavin said, finally saying my name as if it required both hands. I was broken. The old defense. I let it pass through me like mist. So was I replied. But I didn't run. A murmur lifted and fell a tide, deciding which shore to choose. He nodded once, the first honest movement of the evening, and stared at the floor like it contained the elevator button for escape. And then, as if a script had run out of pages, the scene refused to continue. Leia's shoulders dropped. She put her cap back on, not to hide, but to conclude. We're done here, she said to me, to the room, to the past. She reached for my hand. I rose. The crowd parted, not with spectacle now, but with a hush that felt like respect. We walked, and the carpet didn't swallow us and the doors didn't groan. They opened like the simplest thing in the world. Outside the ballroom, the hallway was cool, long, newly ordinary. Leia exhaled. The breath sounded like a chord resolving. She looked up at me with eyes that were wet and steady at once. I wasn't going to let her humiliate you, she said softly. Not after everything. I traced the edge of her jaw with my gaze, the way you trace a horizon when you realize you're still here to see it. You didn't have to do that, I whispered and meant it. I did, she answered and meant it more. You saved me. It was time I returned the favor. The words stitched something closed inside my chest, a seam I hadn't known was still open. We had just reached the end of the hallway when heels clicked fast behind us. Wait. Serena's voice, stripped of polish, ran toward us. She arrived with mascara smudged and pride in ribbons, a woman whose story had tipped and spilled. For the first time that night, she looked real. She looked scared. And she looked like someone deciding whether the truth would be a wound or an opening. Serena's dress rustled as she caught up silk, dragging like a veil of defeat behind her. You can't just do that, she snapped, though her voice quavered. You can't hijack my wedding and humiliate us. Us? Leia tilted her head, eyebrows raised. Her tone was steady, almost curious. I didn't say a single thing that wasn't true. Serena's mouth opened, then closed, like she was searching for a script that had vanished. You could have handled it privately. She tried again, but even she didn't sound convinced. No, I said, finally stepping forward. My voice surprised me, calm, but edged with steel I hadn't known I carried. You could have handled it privately, but you chose to stand in front of a room full of strangers and turn me into a villain. You wanted a spectacle, Serena. You just didn't expect the story to turn on you. Her eyes flicked between us, restless, like a trapped bird trying to find a window. I didn't know, she stammered. I didn't know he had a daughter. Did you ask, Leia, cut in her voice sharp enough to pierce? Or did you just believe the story that made you feel superior? Silence. Serena's lips parted, but no words came. And then Gavin appeared behind her. His tie hung loose, his jacket unbuttoned, the easy composure he'd once worn like a second skin now cracked and slipping. Leia, he said, softer than before, almost pleading. I never meant for this to happen. She turned toward him slowly. Which part, she asked. Me being born? You abandoning me? Or watching someone else raise me while you pretended we didn't exist? He flinched, shoulders tightening. I thought I was protecting you, he muttered the words, stumbling out like excuses he'd rehearsed for years. Protecting us. I said, the anger in my throat finally uncoiling. By disappearing. For the first time since I had walked into that ballroom, his eyes met mine. And in that gaze, raw and unguarded, I saw the man I had once loved. Not the one with the polished smile, but the hollow boy who had never learned how to stay. I was broken, Amara, he whispered. I was too, I answered. My voice didn't shake, but I didn't leave. The words hit him harder than any scream could have. His expression faltered, split wide open. For once, he had nothing left to offer, no weapon but silence. I used to tell myself you were dead, Leia said, stepping closer. Her eyes gleamed wet, but fierce. Because thinking you just didn't care was worse. She swallowed hard. But you were alive, and you chose to forget me. Gavin's lips parted, then pressed shut again as if the truth had sealed them. He lowered his gaze to the floor, staring at nothing. And then something I never expected happened. Leia lifted her chin, her shoulders squared, and she said, I forgive you. His head jerked up, startled. You do? She shook her head firmly. Not for you, for me. Because carrying your absence is exhausting, and I'm done. Tears glistened at the corners of his eyes, and for once Gavin didn't hide them. You're incredible, he whispered. I know, Laya said, soft but unyielding, then she pointed at me. She made me that way. The words nearly undid me. My knees trembled, but I held my ground. In that instant, I understood something no applause, no validation, no revenge could ever give me. I had not failed. I had not been broken beyond repair. I had raised a daughter strong enough to face the man who abandoned her and kind enough to set herself free. Serena folded her arms, bitterness clinging to her like perfume gone sour. So what now? She scoffed. You just walk away and pretend you didn't wreck the night. Laya tilted her head. You wrecked it the moment you built it on lies. Her gaze was steady. If you wanted a perfect story, you should have picked someone with nothing to hide. Her words sliced clean. Serena's mouth twisted, but she had no reply. We turned then, the three of us frozen in a tableau. No photograph would ever capture the woman who lied, the man who ran, and the two who survived. Laya's hand slipped into mine, and together we walked past them into the night. The sky outside was vast, and bruised clouds stretched like torn fabric across the stars. A drizzle had begun, soft and cold, but I didn't care. None of us did. Uncle Joe stood by the car watching us approach. His eyes flicked toward the hotel doors where Gavin lingered like a man stranded between two worlds. Joe gave a slow nod. Guess that's what you'd call a mic drop moment. Leia laughed, a sound raw and bright, and for the first time in years I laughed with her. Not bitter, not hollow, real. And in that laughter I felt lighter, not because Gavin finally saw what he lost, not because Serena was silenced, but because we had told the truth. And now everyone else knew it too. The next morning the world felt strangely quiet, as if the night before had tilted something inside me, and the earth had settled differently beneath my feet. I didn't expect the ripples to reach beyond that ballroom, but they did. It started with whispers. Clips filmed on shaky phones appeared on TikTok overnight, grainy footage of a waitress standing tall, her voice cutting through clinking glasses. I'm his daughter, she declared, and strangers online repeated it like a rallying cry. Titles scrolled past. Waitress shuts down, bride's insult with epic speech. People shared, commented, debated. But I didn't watch them. I didn't need to. I had lived it. Messages began flooding my inbox. Friends I hadn't spoken to in years wrote to me, some apologizing for pulling away when my life collapsed, others saying only, "You were brave." The strange part was, I didn't feel brave. Not when Serena mocked me, not when the crowd laughed, not even when Leia stood up and turned the night on its head. I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like someone who had finally stopped trying to disappear. Gavin never called. No apology, no explanation, no last-ditch plea. And maybe that was its own kind of answer. His silence had always told the truth louder than words. Serena's name floated through gossip circles for a week or two. I heard she left the reception early, skipped the honeymoon send-off, and moved out within the month. Whether they broke up or pretended to hold on, I didn't care. Because in the end, the story had never been about them. It was about us, me and Laya. Something shifted in our home after that night. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, steady, like the air after a storm finally clears. Laya walked taller. She didn't shrink from conversations anymore, didn't apologize for taking up space. Once I caught her in front of the bathroom mirror, practicing her speech again, not out of vanity, but preparation. Later, she told me she was thinking of starting a podcast. For girls who think they don't have a voice, she explained. I felt my heart ache with pride. And me, I started something too. For years I had been afraid to talk about what happened. There's shame in being left and being abandoned. People look at you differently, like your pain is contagious, like your story is a cautionary tale. But after that wedding, I realized something I had never dared to believe. I wasn't weak because I broke. I was strong because I rebuilt. So I wrote. First just notes, then essays. I sent one to a parenting blog, half expecting silence. Instead, they published it. Comments poured in, mothers, daughters, women I'd never met thanking me for saying aloud what they couldn't. That turned into a small blog, then into a support group, and eventually into something I never imagined, a nonprofit. We called it The Second Thread. It wasn't flashy, just a space for women piecing themselves back together after abandonment, divorce, betrayal. We offered counseling, writing workshops, circles where silence was not required. It grew slowly like a garden no one thought could survive the winter. But it bloomed. The most powerful moments weren't public. They were quiet ones. Like a night in January, when I was at the sink rinsing dishes and Laya sat at the counter flipping through her notebook. Out of nowhere, she said, "You know, I used to wish my real mom had stayed." My hands froze in the water. I turned, bracing for the ache, but she continued, soft and sure. "Now I get it. Maybe she left because I was supposed to end up with you." Tears stung my eyes before I could stop them. I dried my hands quickly and pulled her into a hug so tight it felt like breathing her in. Sometimes life rips the story from your hands, tearing out pages before you're ready. Sometimes you're left with fragments, blank spaces where the ending should be. But sometimes, if you keep going, if you fight and love and stay, you get something better than the story you thought you wanted. You get to write a new one. And the best part, you don't need anyone's permission to begin. If this story touched you, if it reminded you of your own strength, or of the person who stood by you when no one else did, take a moment. Give this video a like. Share it with someone who needs to know that broken doesn't mean worthless, that walking away doesn't always make you strong, but staying, healing, rebuilding, that does. And if you've ever held the pieces of your world together when someone else dropped them, leave a comment below. Tell your story. You never know who might read it and feel less alone. And if you want more true stories, raw, messy, real stories that remind you of resilience, of truth, of the beauty in surviving the wreckage, make sure to subscribe. New stories drop every week. Because you don't need to be invited into someone else's fairy tale when you're already writing your own.